Why I'm not an atheist anymore. For most of my life until I was about 25 years old, I was a full-blown atheist. And I wasn't just some atheist who was neutral toward religion either. I used to believe that science could and eventually would be able to explain everything. And because of that, I was openly against all forms of religion and spirituality. I thought religion held us back as a society. I used to look down on people who believed in God. I made fun of them, talked down to them, and I actually used to believe that if you believed in God, you were probably less intelligent. Like you genuinely just had a lower IQ. And I'm deeply ashamed and embarrassed to admit all of that. But it's the truth. And I admit it as a way of taking responsibility for the way I used to act, and as a way of showing repentance for the way I used to think. So, what happened, right? Why did I stop being an atheist? It started when I turned 18 years old and began trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I remember that for the first time at that age, I got to finally decide for myself who I wanted to be, what I wanted to do, and where I wanted to go in my life. But as I followed that line of questioning, I eventually found myself asking a deeper question underneath all of them. And that question was, what's the meaning of life? Because how could I know what to do with my life if I didn't know what life itself was even for? How could I know who I was supposed to become if I didn't know why I was here to begin with? And how could I know where to go if I didn't know where I should even be trying to go? And so that question, right? What's the meaning of life? It began to haunt me for years. And trying to answer it began to expose a lot of cracks in the way I saw reality. And so I began seriously trying to find the answer to what the meaning of life was. Now, to be clear, the atheistic worldview I held was basically just scientific materialism. That sounds complicated, but all it really means is that I believed the physical universe was all there was, right? I believed there was no God, no greater purpose built into reality, and that science and evolution could eventually explain everything. So, from the very beginning of this journey, God and religion were completely removed from the equation for me, which meant that at the time, I mainly looked for answers in three places: philosophy, the world/society around me, and my own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So I began with philosophy. I remember thinking to myself, surely the greatest thinkers throughout history have found the meaning of life. Surely some of the greatest minds of all time have figured out some kind of meaningful answer to this question, so I can finally stop thinking about it and move on with my life. And without a doubt, I found that philosophy has a lot of different answers. Some philosophies focused on happiness, some taught virtue and self control, some focused on freedom and pleasure, some focused on power and greatness, and others argued that life had no real meaning at all, and that we simply had to create our own meaning instead. And I believe that many of the people behind these ideas were genuinely searching for the truth. I believe a lot of their ideas contained real wisdom. But the deeper I looked at these philosophies, the more I kept running into the exact same problem. Without God, I couldn't see what actually made any of their answers true. A philosopher could tell me to pursue happiness, but why was happiness the actual purpose of my existence? They could tell me to live a good and virtuous life, but what made virtue truly good? They could tell me to pursue freedom or self-control, but freedom and self-control for what? They could tell me to create my own meaning. But the thing is, if I created it, then I wasn't discovering the actual meaning of life. I was just making one up for myself. And if every person could simply invent their own meaning, then one person could decide that life was about love and serving others, while another person could decide that life was about dominating other people and getting whatever they wanted, right? And without some real standard above them both, how could I say that one meaning was actually better, more truthful, or more morally right than the other? And those were the problems I kept encountering. Because whenever I followed these answers all the way to the end, they all seemed to just collapse into some combination of four things: pleasure, power, self-created meaning, or nihilism, which is basically the belief that nothing has any real meaning at all. Which led me to the conclusion that the meaning of life was either to just pursue whatever felt good, which is basically just hedonism, which basically just means to pursue pleasure, or it was to pursue strength, success, control, influence, and dominance, or it was to invent whatever personal meaning I wanted, or it was to simply accept that there was no real meaning to life at all. And from what I could see at the time, without something higher than human opinion deciding what was truly good, what was truly right, and what human beings were actually worth, I couldn't see what stopped these ideas from eventually turning into like self-indulgence or taking advantage of other people or pride or despair or simply some form of degeneracy. Philosophy gave me a lot of possible ways to live, but it never clearly told me what life itself was actually for. It couldn't tell me why anything truly mattered, or why one way of living was really better than another. It couldn't tell me what the meaning of life was. And that left me at a complete dead end with philosophy. So I went to the next source, right? I looked at what the world and society around me seemed to be telling me I should do with my life, which, funny enough, wasn't much different from what I found in philosophy. From what I could see, the world was telling me to spend my life chasing pleasure, comfort, entertainment, and distraction. It was also telling me to chase money, influence, power, and status. That I should basically try to create the most comfortable and impressive life for myself that I possibly could, and to not think much further than that. But the thing was, whenever I stopped and asked why, right? Like, why should I chase pleasure? Why should I chase power? Why should I chase status? Why are these things important? Why do they actually matter? And not only that, when I do chase these things and I do get some of them, why do I still feel empty inside? When I would ask these kinds of questions to people, I never found a meaningful answer. And if someone did have an answer, it was usually just something like, I don't know, that's just what people do. Or that's just what you're supposed to want. And it never got much deeper than that. And, well, what do you know? From what I saw, when you spend your entire life chasing nothing more than pleasure, power, money, and status, those things also seem to lead toward emptiness, self-indulgence, and ultimately some form of degeneracy. And so that left me with the last place I knew to look for an answer: myself, my own thoughts, my own feelings, and my own experiences. And when I examined what was inside of me, when I looked at the world around me, at the experiences I had, and the people I loved, when I thought about good and evil, justice, morality, truth, and love, when I looked up at the night sky at 2 in the morning, trying to put everything together, trying to figure it all out, right? I remember feeling this tremendous weight on my heart and soul. It almost felt like something inside of me was like gripping my heart and squeezing it with all its might. And it was screaming at me from inside that this wasn't all just random, that this wasn't all just some meaningless cosmic accident, that there was a real reason behind all of life. And not some reason I can simply like make up for myself. I mean, a real reason. One that was true whether I liked it or not. One that actually lined up with goodness, love, and truth, and the reality that I was experiencing. A real reason that we could not only find, but actually live by. And I want to be clear here, those feelings were not proof to me that God existed, but they forced me to seriously question whether the atheistic worldview I held could actually explain everything I was experiencing. And so, from my perspective, I took the next logical step in the journey, right? I began looking in all of the places I had completely ignored from the beginning. I began researching and seriously considering religion and the possibility that God might actually exist. And mind you, I wasn't approaching it from the standpoint of, oh man, I don't know what to live for, so I'm just going to use religion to make myself feel better. Because believe me, I was just as much against that idea as I was against all the other answers I had already found. Rather, I approached it more like this. I thought to myself, from what I can see, I've reached the limits of the secular answers I know how to find. But something inside of me still believes that there is a real answer to this question. The question being the meaning of life. So I'm going to take the next logical step and look at everything I previously refused to consider, even if I don't fully agree with it, and even if I don't like what I find. And so, when I finally became willing to seriously consider the existence of God, a lot of the things that had confused me for years began making a lot more sense. Now, if I try to explain absolutely everything I came to find when looking at God and religion, this video would probably be 10 hours long. So I'll probably make separate videos breaking these points down more thoroughly in the future. But generally speaking, right, what happened was the more I looked at reality itself, the more difficult it became for me to believe that all of this was nothing more than a meaningless cosmic accident. I began thinking seriously about things like the fact that anything exists at all. The order and structure of reality, right? The fact that the universe follows consistent patterns, and the fact that our minds are actually capable of understanding those patterns. All of that only began making a lot more sense to me if some kind of intelligence was behind reality, rather than there being no deeper intelligence or purpose behind it at all. And the same thing happened when I looked at morality, right? Things like goodness, justice, love, truth, and human value. I already lived as though these things were actually real. I think a lot of us do. I lived as though love was truly better than hatred, that truth was better than lies, and goodness was truly better than evil. And I began to realize that these things made significantly more sense if they came from something higher than just human opinion and preferences. Because if morality was nothing more than something human beings invented, then human beings could simply change it whenever they wanted, right? And the thing is, I didn't believe that evil could suddenly become good just because people approved of it. I didn't believe that human beings only had value because society decided to give them value. It seemed to me that goodness, human value, and morality had to come from something higher than us. And then there was consciousness itself, right? The fact that we can think, reason, search for truth, experience love, and question the meaning of our own existence. That also became incredibly difficult for me to explain as nothing more than like mindless physical matter moving around in space. Now, none of these things gave me absolute mathematical proof that God existed, obviously, right? But when I stepped back and looked at all of them together, the existence of some kind of intelligence behind reality, some kind of God, right, began making far more sense of the world to me than the atheistic and materialistic worldview I previously held. For the first time in my life, it genuinely appeared to me that it was more likely that all of reality came from some kind of God rather than there being no God at all. Which then led me to another question. If God actually exists, then who or what is God? And has this God revealed himself to us in any meaningful way? And so I realized that the next step was to look at what kind of evidence was available to answer those questions. I began looking more seriously at religion. I especially looked at Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And again, if I tried to explain absolutely everything I studied, everything I learned, and every reason I eventually came to believe that Christianity was true, this video would probably be another 10 hours long. And that part of the journey deserves its own videos, I think. But generally speaking, when I looked at Christianity and its explanation of God, and its explanation of good and evil, and its explanation of human nature, and sin, and suffering, and love, and meaning, and all those things, and the reason we seem to know how we should live, yet constantly fail to live that way, it all began to form a complete picture of reality for me. And not in some shallow way like, oh, well, this all sounds right, so it must be true. I mean that when I compared Christianity with the world I was actually living in, with human nature, with my own experiences, and with the questions I had been asking for years, Christianity seemed to explain reality better and more rationally than any other worldview I had encountered up to that point. Especially when I began looking at Christ and his life, his teachings, his claims, his death, and the historical claim that he rose from the dead. The more seriously I looked at all of it together, the harder Christianity became for me to just dismiss. It didn't seem like a random collection of like religious ideas we just invented. It seemed to offer a complete explanation of reality, of who God is, of who we are, of what has gone wrong with us, and of what God has done to save us from that. And once again, I'm not saying that I found some absolute mathematical proof that forced me to believe. But when I compared Christianity with the other explanations I'd encountered, it appeared to make the most sense to me. It appeared to explain the most and ultimately be the most likely to be true in my mind. And that is what eventually moved me from simply believing that some kind of God existed to believing in the God revealed through Jesus Christ. And so, to put it plainly, I'm no longer an atheist because when I look at all of the evidence available to me, it appears more likely that God exists than that there is no God at all. The existence and order of reality, consciousness, reason, love, morality, meaning, and the person of Jesus Christ all make significantly more sense to me if reality ultimately comes from a God. And not only that, but without God, from what I can see, there's no solid foundation outside of human opinion for truth, goodness, love, justice, morality, or human value. And whenever I followed a godless, human centered way of seeing life all the way to the end, it all seemed to just eventually collapse into some combination of just pleasure, power, made up meaning, or the belief that nothing really matters, which, in my eyes, ultimately just leads to some form of degeneracy eventually. And I also realized that my belief that science could one day explain absolutely everything was not something that science itself had proven. It was actually just a philosophical belief that I accepted without ever seriously questioning it. Science can tell us an incredible amount about how the physical world works, but science cannot by itself tell us why anything exists. It can't tell us what life is ultimately for, why human beings have real value, or why anything is truly good or evil. And I don't claim to have absolute certainty about any of this, but after examining the alternatives as honestly as I knew how, God became the most reasonable explanation of reality available to me. And Christianity became the most reasonable explanation of who and what that God is. And that's why I'm not an atheist anymore.